Today I'm going to talk about my topic, visual grief, and I'm going to present to you the broad strokes of a larger project I've been working on for about 5 years now. You're seeing a work in progress. Clearly hasn't been fully written yet. It's in pieces and I'm really thinking it through. And the part that I'm gonna focus on today that you're gonna see is the comics focus part. So I should say my background a little bit. So I'm a memoir scholar, a comics scholar, and the first book that I wrote was about the ways that comics can help us rethink our senses of self, both in time and over time. And then about 5 years ago, I became interested. I started to realize how many graphic narratives were about grief. And particularly since I'm a memoir scholar, I was looking at the nonfiction ones. And not just how many were specifically dedicated to stories about grief, but also how many just mentioned grief in passing. So I started to read lots and lots of memoirs, and I'm going to use the term memoirs of grief and loss. For me, it's a much more capacious bundle of books. You know, if we're going to create a taxonomy, mine is not really a genre. So there are scholars, certainly memoir scholars, Sydney Smith and Julia Watson, for example, who have categorized memoirs. They call them memoirs of grief or memoirs of mourning and grief. You'll hear these various terms. And that's a genre that really focuses on the aftermath to a loss, usually of a person, although of course grief can happen after the loss of different kinds of things. But today I'll mainly be focused on the loss of a person. So this genre is books that are dedicated to, that are focused on that experience of loss. And what I found as I started to read more and more of these memoirs, and I should also say that I didn't just read memoirs and comics. I just tried to get my hands on anything that was prose, poetry, even photographic texts that were telling stories about grief. But the more that I started to go through all of these texts, the more I realized how many memoirs not necessarily that would not necessarily fall in this category mention grief at some point. And so for my broader category, memoirs of grief and loss, the books I'm looking at don't always have grief at the center. And indeed, many wouldn't even be considered narratives of grief. Often in them, as you'll see, there's a singular image. Sometimes it's a photograph in a comic, sometimes it's a drawing that breaks the narrative, that you could say it erupts. And you could even say that it allows the reader to sense this looming grief over the rest of the story. In other words, once the reader encounters that image or that moment of grief, it sort of looms over the rest of the narrative and reshapes the narrative. Now, there are three central framing questions to my broader project. The first is, why do people write stories of grief, right? This is the question that you often hear a lot of the same answer. You'll hear the word catharsis thrown around. The general idea is for someone who's gone through an experience of loss, they're turning chaos into order. And of course, this is not to say that the books are all orderly or that they can make sense of grief. In fact, a lot of, especially more contemporary memoirs, are very messy. And the grief sort of, the shape of the book reflects the messiness of grief and how there's not real resolution in the ways that we might expect or might even want from a narrative. But that's the first framing question. And reading through these texts, I wanted to see, are there other ways of thinking about why people might write these memoirs? The second framing question is, why do people read them? Again, there are some common answers given by critics, by reviewers, even by the writers or cartoonists themselves. So oftentimes you'll hear it's a form of consolation. If you are in the throes of what we could think of as deep grief, it can be a form of consolation to read about someone going through the same experience. So that's the answer that's most often given. And then sometimes you'll hear, and of course that answer is incomplete because we know that the number of people reading these memoirs, if anyone listens to NPR Fresh Air, there's a new one there's a new person interviewed almost every week who's written a memoir about grief. These are best-selling books. So we know it's not just people in deep grief who are reading them. Another answer often given is, oh, this is a form of preparation. If it ever happens to me, maybe this will help me prepare for my own experience of losing a parent, especially those books that are aimed at more common losses. And this too feels like a really incomplete answer. And that's something that I'm trying to address in my research, is to really move beyond those answers and see whether we can actually think of a component that doesn't center the reader and their own experience, but actually centers the experience of the author or the narrator of the piece. The third framing question, and the one that you'll see addressed I did bring slides, I promise, and there's many of them. The third framing question is, what can we learn about the experience of grief if we attend closely to some of these stories and also think about trends that cut across them? And that's the one that you'll see today, that I'm going to try to address one interesting aspect that I've found in reading through all of this literature. Now, of course, when we think about grief, we think about the professional literature, all of the narratives that are out there about, you may have heard of the 5 stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You may have heard of the resistance to the 5 stages of grief. You may have heard of complicated grief, grief that never ends. There's all of these debates in the professional literature. Is there a certain time frame for grief, for after that person has been lost? Are there stages? Is there something we should be looking for? Is there something we should be doing? A lot of this, I would argue, starts with, or pretty much becomes very popularized with Freud in 1917 with his Mourning and Melancholia, where he gives a very specific task to the griever. The griever is meant to let go of the person, the idea, the place. And as much as, Freud is going pretty far back at this point, the truth is that we've really held on to this notion of grief as a process with a particular end in mind. But the other thing that I think that Freud gave us that I want to sort of play with and resist today is this notion that grief is atomized. And what do I mean by that? When Freud wrote about mourning, he was talking about mourning in relation to a particular person, right? He also a place, but today I'm going to focus on people. So one particular experience. But from reading all of these memoirs, what I found is something that I'm calling the connective nature of grief. And there are 2 prongs to what I'm calling the connective nature of grief. I'm going to mainly focus on slides that'll show us the first, and then I'll talk a little bit about the second. So by the connective nature of grief, what I mean is that individual experiences of loss are always tied to other individual experiences of loss, so losses that you've had over your life, as well as communal ones. In other words, communal losses that are maybe occurring at the same time or that have occurred. And the second prong, which I'll talk about a little bit less, is that individual experiences of loss, and this is something that's actually increasingly in the professional literature, are relational. In other words, grief doesn't happen in a vacuum. Some people distinguish between grief and mourning, right? Grief is the internal part, mourning is the practice with the people around you. I use grief interchangeably with mourning because to me, there's no way of having that internal experience without the people around you, right? It's a complicated question. So the second prong of that notion of the connective nature of grief is the relational one, right? That we're always grieving and our grief experience is shaped by the people around us. Okay, so I'm going to now introduce my response to this topic, or my answer to this, where I came up with this connective nature of grief, with 2 autobiographical stories. I'm an autobiography scholar. I've actually not done this in my first book, but it felt like looking back and trying to figure out why I even came to this topic, 2 stories came to mind that had happened to me just a couple of years before I actually started looking into this topic. So the first has to do with my grandfather. So my grandfather was born in 1917, in a very small town near the capital of Slovakia. He died in 2009. Now, when he died, what did I know of his story? The core of my grandfather's story was that he was a Holocaust survivor. I knew all about the Holocaust. I read about it growing up. I was very focused on it because I knew that my grandfather had been a survivor. He had not been in a concentration camp, but the majority of his very large family had been killed in concentration camps, had been murdered there. He had one surviving sister, Helen, who had survived Auschwitz, come to El Paso, Texas via Canada. And I had seen her a couple of times in my life. She died when I was 16 years old. My parents told me of a broken heart. So this is what I knew. And I had very little information in grieving my own grandfather. It was really this Holocaust narrative that was hovering over my grief. But he was not someone who ever wanted to talk about his own experience. So I decided, as part of my own grief response, to interview my mother. Of course, I asked her if she was okay with it. It was something that I think was helpful for her too. Now, I reread this interview recently. It was very eye-opening to reread it. But one thing that really stuck out to me, and that connects with this notion I have of the connective nature of grief, has to do with this very heartbreaking story that came out in our interview. And it was this: I had known that my grandfather's only surviving sister, Helen, had been through Auschwitz. I had known that she had been experimented on, as many women were in Auschwitz, and that as a result of that, she had trouble conceiving. I knew that she had ended up having 2 young children when she moved to El Paso and married another survivor, another concentration camp survivor. And I knew the story that my mother told me, which was this very tragic story, that when the boys were very young in El Paso, Texas, they were in a car accident and the 2 of them were killed. But the story wasn't as familiar as it should have been. In other words, for someone who was so focused and interested in intergenerational trauma, the fact that my mother's only 2 surviving cousins had been killed had really escaped a lot of my attention. And so, and I'll show you, I did at the time some research, and I found the news article from 1964 announcing this collision. No one in my family had seen this newspaper article. No one really talked about this awful experience. Now, what I started to think in retrospect, after I started to do my research, was the ways in which the story of the Holocaust had overshadowed this very personal story of grief. And this got me thinking about the relationship between various experiences of grief, especially, but not only, communal and individual, and the ways in which the emphasis on one story, whether it's communal or individual, can often erase others, right? And on the other hand, right, on the other side of that coin, sometimes speaking in concert or looking at 2 instances of loss in relationship to each other can actually make us rethink the way we see one or the other. So this is an ethical problem to me. And one thing that I've been thinking about lately, if anyone has heard about missing white girl syndrome in the media, right? It's this note, and I say the media, but there's not one media, there are many medias. Let's clarify that. So it's this notion that when a white woman is killed or goes missing, there's undue media attention on those women, and that erases many stories of Black women, women of color, other women, trans women who aren't necessarily. It's missing cis white woman syndrome, just to be clear. And it erases all of these other stories. And if you think about it, the paradox here is, what happens when you narrow in, when you give your attention to someone's story of loss? Inevitably, there's just not time to talk about all of the other stories. So you are always, in some ways, pushing out another story. Now, as a comic scholar, this sort of theory that was floating in my head, or this idea that was floating in my head about connective grief, of course, connected me to one of the most famous graphic memoirs ever written. And I wouldn't actually call Maus, Art Spiegelman's Maus, Pulitzer Prize winning, I wouldn't call it a memoir of grief. So if you're looking for a genre to attribute to it, going back to Sydney Smith and Julia Watson autobiography scholars, they have this whole taxonomy of genres. You might call it a narrative of witness, right? Because it's really about Art Spiegelman witnessing the Holocaust through his father's eyes, his father's witness. Yet, within both volumes of Mouse, and this is the cover of the second volume, there are these grief narratives, right? And the first book really emphasizes Spiegelman's mother's suicide, her death by suicide, and his working through that. And the second book, on the very final page of Mouse, you see this gravestone announcing his father's death. His father's the subject of both books that Spiegelman's been interviewing all along. And his death is very suddenly announced. And I sort of chopped up the page so I can zero in on this bottom corner. But this is just from the very bottom of the page. So we know that in many ways, Mouse, the two books, even if they're not necessarily narratives of grief, there is this sense of the grief over a father and a mother hovering over them. But there's this other story too. So this is actually from the dedication page of the second volume of Mouse. And lots of scholars, Marianne Hirsch and others, have written about how it's one of the few photographs in Mouse, which really makes it stand out. The rest of the book is all comics, or not all of it. There's a couple of photographs throughout. And the dedication page is a rare instance of paying attention to this young boy who was Art Spiegelman's brother, a brother he never met, who died in the Holocaust. His story is told within the narrative by the father. He heard what happened to his son, how his son died. It's told in just a couple of pages, but there's not much attention given to Richu's story. Then at the very end of the entire volume is this final panel right here, where Spiegelman's been interviewing his father. He's been drawing and writing his father's story. And the final line his father says before his death is announced, "I'm tired from talking, Richu, and it's enough stories for now." And it's this form of addressing Art, of course, as his dead brother. So what I get from this is the sense that this other story of grief is bookending the narrative, right? It's hovering over the narrative, it's looming, and it really is shaping the story, even if it's not necessarily the focus. And I see this in a number of books. So I'll just show you briefly how this sort of looming grief functions in different stories. So this is Roz Chast, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? I'm not going to go too far into the narrative, but it's a story about Roz Chast talking about the last years and months and days of her parents' lives. And she is there to witness their final days, their final months, all of the things that happen to them along the way. And actually, I didn't include that image, so I'll pause. And so the book is really about her relationship with them and tracking their eventual deaths. And yet, in the introduction to the book, Chast includes this story. And without reading the whole page, it's this story, what her parents call, it's part of what they call family lore. Her mother calls it that mess. Her mother doesn't want to speak about it. And you'll notice a common theme in a lot of these books when it's the death of a young child or a baby or miscarriage, there's often the sense that people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to focus on the story, not always, but often. So this is the first baby. It's a baby who was born years before Chast was even conceived. The baby lived for one day. Her mother gave birth to her at 7.5 months and then died after a day. Now, Chast includes this image at the beginning of the story, but she never really goes back to it. So this is another instance where this other story of grief sort of hangs over the narrative and shapes the way that we see the rest of the story, this loss of one parent and then another parent, which in itself, by the way, is connective, right? Because it's not the story of the loss of one, it's the story of the loss of two parents. Now, what becomes really interesting too, and what really connects this story to Mouse, is that about a year after Chast publishes her book, she publishes a short piece in the New Yorker. And the story in that short piece is essentially a fan, a very eager fan, who reached out to her, who found the cemetery where her sister was buried. And it's a story of Chast going to visit that cemetery. There's a photograph of the burial site. So once again, we have a story that's not necessarily about that experience of grief, bookended by this other experience. So again, we can see this connective nature of grief. The other thing that happens in Chast's book, so she writes about how her parents didn't like to talk about being Jewish or didn't like to talk about death, these two things. Also in the introduction, she talks about her family history, right? How, as she says, her parents and their ancestors had tough lives, way, way tougher than mine, right? So these terrible stories about the Russian cholera epidemic, the Depression, World War II, the Holocaust, she mentions them. And in that way, there's this, again, connective nature of grief, even if that's not necessarily part of the story she's telling with the loss of her parents. It's there and it's shaping the narrative. It's shaping her experience of grief in relationship to the loss of her parents and to their own, the story of the loss of themselves. All right, I'm going to skip over this slide. I want to show you one more really interesting example. Actually, I think I have two more interesting examples of the connective nature of grief, of connecting individual and communal experiences of grief in Shira Stein's very recent Red Rock Baby Candy. It was published in 2021 by Fantagraphics Books. Now, this is a very different story. The book is just radically, it's beautiful. All of the pages are somewhat different. Actually, this is probably one of the more orthodox pages that looks like comics, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them, Stein is heavily influenced by textiles, by the artist Faith Ringgold's work. So the book is really unorthodox, unconventional in the way that it tells the story. But also what's really interesting about the book is, again, it's not necessarily billed as a grief narrative. I mean, I guess you can sort of read between the lines in the cover of the book, but it actually never necessarily focuses on one experience of grief. Instead, it interweaves numerous experiences. The first being the author's loss of her father, right? And so here you see a page where she's writing about what loss feels like for her, and it's early on in the book. Later, the book travels to start talking about other experiences of loss that she's had as a queer woman. She and her wife were trying to conceive, and she had numerous miscarriages and problems with infertility. And so what you see in this page here is, you can see it at the top, she writes, beneath one loss, there is another. And so what Stein does in her book, and there's really interesting, if anyone's interested, we could talk about it during the Q&A, but she uses, once again, the form of comics here in layering to give a sense of the ways in which losses accumulate over time and the ways in which different losses affect each other. Right? The ways that one loss, for example, one experience of grief looms over, connects with, is added to another. So here is another page from Stein's work, and it's called Grieving in Fuchsia, this page. And I love this page because what it really shows, it's almost a visual metaphor for the ways in which loss covers over one's entire world. And I think I'm thinking mainly of deep loss, right? But we could think about loss in general, the feeling that life is changed after one experiences the loss of someone close to them, and or miscarriage, infertility, all of these losses sort of combine. And you can see visually on the page how the page is colored in this fuchsia color that's meant to give a sense of the ways that grief has really reshaped the narrator's worldview. Okay, I'm going to show you one more set of examples for this first connective aspect of grief. So this is Leila Corman's work. She's a fantastic cartoonist. And this is actually, you can find it online even right now on tablet, although she later published it in a collection called We All Wish for Deadly Force. But this was initially published on tablet in 2013. Yahrzeit is the name of the Jewish prayer for the dead. And Corman is writing about the loss of her young daughter who died at a very young age. And she's connecting that loss to her grandfather's story about losing his entire family, again, in the Holocaust, to Nazi murderers. And so you can see in this page, she uses this shape, this tunnel shape, to give a sense of these connections that I'm talking about between these different experiences of loss. And you can even see the ways in which the map of Poland, and we all know what happened in September of 1939, it jumps onto the page in the middle of this other story of loss, her first child, the loss of her first child. And she continues to use this shape throughout the narrative. It's a short, I can't remember, maybe 7 or so page comic. And she shows the ways in which, and you can see she and her grandfather by this time has passed. So she's also combining not just her loss and her grandfather's loss, but also her loss of her grandfather. She's combining their experiences to show the ways in which loss makes the individuals who are in deep grief feel separated from the rest of the world, right? Here, she and her grandfather are actually sharing that same space of grief, but there's also a distance between them because their experiences obviously are still separate, even if she's inviting readers to see them as connected in this way. And of course, as readers, we are looking almost through a keyhole or a portal and experiencing our own attention. And this brings us to that third question I had, my overarching question: why read these narratives of grief? And, you know, one of the driving factors of my work over time has been that part of it is to teach us, those who are not, and when I say us, there very well might be some of us who are deep in grief right now. That's not what I mean to say. I don't mean to erase that possibility. But the readers who are not in the moment currently experiencing grief, or who are deep grief, or who are not experiencing the kinds of grief that these individuals are experiencing, are still invited to be in proximity to this grief, right? To attend to it. And that, I think, is an interesting way of thinking about why read those memoirs. It's almost an ethical compulsion, right? We do it in order to invite those grievers back into the world because grief can be so isolating. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. So here's another page, and you'll notice Corman draws, in a sense, she draws her own grief as an individual that she's carrying on her shoulders. And so that figure could apply to her, it could apply to her grandfather, it could be the figure of her grandfather. So she's drawing these shapes that we can, in a sense, attach different experiences of grief or read different experiences of grief into these shapes. Okay, so now I want to turn to that second story, and I promise I'll wrap it up soon enough. I'm going to turn to that second autobiographical experience that I thought about in terms of, you know, really thinking through, how did I even get to this project? So first, there was that loss of my grandfather in 2009. And then in 2012, a close friend of mine lost her 4-year-old child very suddenly in another tragic accident. Now, my initial impulse in that situation, I'd never experienced a close friend losing someone who wasn't, you know, a grandparent or even a parent. I'd never experienced that sort of tragedy up close. After the funeral was over, very painful, difficult early days, I remember wanting to connect with this friend and speaking to a friend and saying, I am afraid. I'm afraid to be in a room with her. I'm afraid. I don't know how to talk to her. I don't know how to be around her. Of course, after all of the research that I've done, I've recognized that this is actually a very common impulse. But I think this is in many ways why that question, why read these narratives, is so important. Because, of course, in a sense, what we do when we read these narratives is we learn how to interact with people who have lost, and we learn how to pay attention without making the situation about us as viewers. So one of the things that happened in the aftermath to that second loss is a friend just happened to have sent me Nicola Streeton's book, Billy, Me and You. And the book was published in 2007, but this was 2012. And I actually had a 6-month-old child at the time. And I remember having been really fearful of reading the book. And in retrospect, I question that, right? Because of course, stories of parents who have lost children, as unusual as they are, they happen. And the more I read about and think about this topic, the more I think how important it is not to push the subject away, but actually to dive in and to be witness to these stories. Now, what happened when I read Nicola's book and Streeton's book, and I read it in part because I wanted to know how to be close to my friend. So I did read it as an educating tool, was she spoke about her own sense of feeling isolated from people around her in her moments of deep grief. And so here's an image where she talks about her daily crying rituals that she really has to hide, and she only feels comfortable crying in front of one or two people who are very close with her. And at the bottom, she writes, "I was terrified by the surrounding taboo, the social limits to the display of grief, and the involuntary judgments of others." This sense of loss, this dyadic sense of loss, that there's a grief on top of grief, which is the grief of all the people around you sort of moving away from you. This is very traceable in many of the memoirs that I've looked at. And I even found it in St. Augustine's Confessions, where he talks about losing his mother and feeling a fresh grief on top of his grief because he feels embarrassed about the feelings that he's showing about this experience of grieving. Here's another image from Streeton's book. And one of the things I love about it is that it takes this really difficult subject, and she's still herself, she still has humor. And here she is talking about, "The more I told people, the more intrigued I became at their responses. I found myself judging people by their reactions." And so here she gives various reactions to her telling people that her child has died and the ways that people respond. And then in her head, she grades them. She judges them based on their responses. We can see in Leila Corman's work too, the sense not just that she's trying to, and I don't mean to say that these authors or cartoonists are out to educate audiences. I think that we're privileged to have the opportunity to learn from these works if we're willing to get close to these experiences of grief and offer them our attention. In Leila Corman's, here's another short work by her up on Nautilus, which has some really extraordinary comics. And here she talks about PTSD, the wound that never heals. She's talking about it in relationship to her experience of loss. But you'll notice, so here she's talking about her interactions out in the world and the ways in which people don't see her grief. And so again, there's this figure attached to her, hovering over her, shaping her own affect that other people can't see. And actually, Joan Didion, in her memoir about her very, I would say it's probably one of the most famous memoirs, grief memoirs, A Year of Magical Thinking, she writes about, she has this beautiful passage where she says, you know, I feel invisible in my grief. Only people who are grieving can see me. So it's this very interesting sense of a division between people not in deep grief and those inviting those living within that experience. And of course, I haven't talked enough about the visual aspects of all of that, but hopefully it's implicit in the ways I'm talking about and the slides that I'm showing here. So here, what's very interesting is not just that as readers, those not in deep grief, we might look at these slides and we might get more of an understanding, as we did with Streeton, about the ways in which grief isolates. But also look at her address here, because you will appear normal. They will think you're normal. She's talking also to an audience of deep grievers. And I think there's a sense in which she's talking to both audiences at once, even as both audiences will read and experience the comic differently. Okay, the last, I'll close up pretty shortly. I've written about Anders Nilsson's Don't Go Where I Can't Follow in the recent Pathographics volume from Penn State. So I have an article on this piece. And this is a memory book that Nilsson published in the wake of his fiancée, Cheryl Weaver's death. And it includes comics and photographs, but this is a comic from the very end of the book where he's tracking this final ceremony where he's spreading his fiancée's ashes in the water. And what you'll notice here is this crowd gathering around him. And I haven't included the final pages, but in the final pages, he's featured alone. So there's a sense in which all of what these memoirs are communicating are the sense of isolation that grieving brings, but also the importance of having or somehow establishing this community in which to grieve, right? And here it's a silent community, they're onlookers. And we can really think about ourselves reading these memoirs as part of that group. And again, what I would argue is that it's an ethical compulsion that would bring us to these memoirs, not necessarily a desire, although of course those other reasons are valid in themselves, but not only a desire for consolation for ourselves. Okay, I'm going to end with I am always getting questions, what else to read? So I'm just including some slides. These are mainly Memoirs of Grief. So this is Anders Nilsson's other book that's actually about the experience of grief, whereas this book is really more focused on mementos from his time with Weaver, although this cartoon is not a memento. And then I'll include one more slide. And I'm happy to, I do have a few more slides I can discuss in the Q&A if there are questions, but I'll end there for now.